Thank you so much, Rich, and thank you one and all for turning up here today. I always appreciate the fact that you are here, I was invited to your 20th anniversary, and I thank you, Rich and Norma. I don't see Norma, and all of you, of course, for inviting me to that amazing event, which I have had to decline. Unfortunately, I would have loved to. I almost RSVP'd, and then I saw what Rich was saying is that they'll make me pay for the food if I'm not there. So I double-checked the date, and of course, I'm on a plane heading to South Africa. So thank you so much for the invitation. I do appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful time there.
And I will pass those comments to Norman.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was reminded today, quite rightly, about something that I want to talk about anyway, and that is not just my forgetfulness, but our forgetfulness. And so today I do intend to reflect, perhaps a little bit critically, on this question of forgetfulness. And in this instance, I'd forgotten to reflect on the panel that I was on Justice for Palestine, and I will try and do that this time at the end. But the forgetfulness that I want to reflect on is altogether far more pernicious than just my simple missing a point about Palestine, because we were having such an amazing discussion, and of course one doesn't think about everything at that time. This is an altogether far more deep question of forgetting that I want to address in particular today. So it's very apposite that you remind me that I'm forgetful. Yes, I know. I know. In fact, I have many devices that help me remember things. And then I forget how to use those devices, and so it goes on. Now, I, as usual, don't know where to start, and I did promise you that I would start at the beginning of time. And in fact, yesterday or the day before, when I was interacting with students, I had the most interesting interactions in relation to answers to questions like, how old is the universe? And how old is the earth? And when did the first beings like us kind of appear and things? And the answers I got, has the sound gone? I feel like the sound has gone down a bit. Yeah. I feel like I don't hear. Can you hear me? Yeah. Because I don't know why the sound has gone.
It's not going.
There, it's back. Is it back?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's back. All right, thank you. It needed that magic touch.
No magic.
It needed that magic touch. Okay, thank you so much. And I lost the train of thought. I got very interesting replies to those questions.
You were on the edge of the universe.
I was indeed, and I got very interesting replies to those questions, which I think are quite important questions to know about. So I was surprised at some of the answers. But if you don't mind, I want to start by reflecting on that letter that I told you I'd received. That was a letter from the future, or it was dated into the future. And I feel altogether more comfortable reading it today because it's no longer the future, but in the past. And I felt very dislocated and disoriented when I'd got it the last time, whereas now I think it's the right thing to do is to read it. And the letter has come from an organization called the Kulumani Support Group. And this support group has worked tirelessly since we had the official TRC in South Africa, has worked tirelessly to advocate for survivors of apartheid human rights atrocities, and has tirelessly kept the case alive for, if you like, not forgetting, if you like, of remembering, and not just remembering, but also acknowledging. So that's why I say thank you so much for that, opportunity to reflect on memory. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read from this letter, which is a particularly powerful letter in the sense that it fast forwards to today. It'll give you a sense of where we stand today with our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a glimpse into what's happening currently in South Africa, and from that we can then go back a little bit and then make our way forwards again to the last session. So it is a press statement, and it's headed in bold: Press Statement, Khulumani Support Group commemorates the 20th anniversary, ring a bell, of the first TRC victim hearing in East London on the 15th of April, 20 years ago. And it's an open letter to all the commissioners and the staff of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it starts off, of course, by saying, "Dear former commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all who were involved in its work," and it then goes on to name them. I'm not going to read all of their names. "Today, exactly 20 years since the TRC victim hearings opened in East London, we remember with sadness those who served on the TRC who have now passed." So 2 of the commissioners have passed, and it recognizes that fact. It then goes on to say, "Today, 15th of April 2016, we have chosen as the national membership organization of victims and survivors of apartheid atrocities to mark the symbolic importance of the date by gathering in front of the venue of that first hearing. Today, 20 years later, we honor the courage of the commissioners who accepted the immense responsibility of managing the TRC process and providing a platform where victims of atrocities committed in the name of apartheid could narrate the terrible things that were done to them and their loved ones in their stand against apartheid. Apartheid that was identified by the United Nations as a crime against humanity. Today we remember the courage of Mrs. Nokhle Mokgape, the first person to testify in the first victims hearing conducted in this venue 20 years ago. It goes on to talk about remembering with Mrs. Mokgape some of the things that had occurred to her, and I'm not going to read those, although I feel almost obliged to. And it talks about Steve Biko and others. And it then goes on to say, "Today, 20 years after this groundbreaking event, Khulumani Support Group calls on the former chairperson and all former commissions and his staff to accept the appreciation of victims of apartheid gross human rights violations for the work they tried to do, whilst also acknowledging the major shortfalls of the TRC process." Yeah. So we're thankful and grateful, and any criticisms, indeed also mine, are couched within this context of the gratitude we have and express towards Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the commissioners and all the participants for the fact that this thing could take place and happened in our country. Khulumani appreciates the well-conceived and well-constructed recommendations on reparations and on rehabilitation that the TRC submitted to government to provide for what it calls the repair of victims. We call on the former TRC commissioners to add their weight to Khulumani's calls for the reopening of a process to make good these critical recommendations. So here's a call by Khulumani to reopen a process 20 years later. This is why I think this letter is kind of important for me to read out here so that we can share the content. We ask that each of the former commissioners expresses their opposition publicly to what's known as the TRC closed list. And that word should bother you immediately. It bothers a lot of people. The closed list that has unfairly and unjustly excluded several thousands of individuals whose lives have made no progress because of TRC failures to ensure they were identified and verified as victims of apartheid gross human rights abuses. We welcome a recent decision. We welcome the decision to exhume the remains of some 90 struggle activists who were hanged for their political stands against apartheid without their names appearing on the TRC closed list. The TRC closed the list at a certain point, 18 months into its deliberations. It closed that list. We welcome this commitment to ensuring appropriate recognition and access to the redress and reparation measures that exist for individuals named on the closed list. So that means those folk who were named had access to some form, limited form of reparation at that time. Kulumani Support Group calls on all those who were associated with the work of the TRC to join Kulumani in its agenda of closing the gaps and finishing the work that was started so well in 1996 with the first public hearing that we remember today. On behalf of all apartheid-era victims and survivors of apartheid gross human rights violations and their families, we call on government, on our government, to finally make good on delivering an integrated and inclusive program of reparations, for which Kulumani activists have sustained a long and difficult struggle since the TRC closed for victims in December 1997 after only 18 months. And then finally, today, Kulumani Support Group announces the launch of a long-planned Kulumani Victims Trust Fund to serve as a vehicle for repairing the lives of those who carried the cost of fighting for justice in South Africa. Kulumani Support Group today calls on all former TRC commissioners and their staff and all other South Africans who are now, in capital letters, repaired, to contribute financially to the, in capital letters, repair of the victims and survivors of apartheid gross human rights violations and their families through contributions to the Kulumani Victims Trust Fund. That's the letter that I got that was dated into the future and which struck such a strong chord in me that I felt I wanted to read it to you. And of course it raises a whole lot of questions, doesn't it, in relation to what is this closed list, how did the TRC function, who got amnesty, who didn't, how were reparations handled, all sorts of questions like that. And I do hope, in fact, to dwell for an hour with you in the next session in detail on the reparations regime of the time, which will give you context in relation to why there's still a call today for reparations in South Africa. I guess the point, one of the points to be made is that you can see that this process isn't over. I think you can hear from this letter that South Africans to this day feel that the TRC is unfinished business and that there are particular aspects, and I'll take questions at the end, sir, that there are particular aspects, so just save that question in that challenging spot. You'll do it better than me, that thing called memory.
I just want to know how to spell Kulumani.
Oh. You see, a policy ought to be flexible, don't you think? A policy that you adhere to in that dogmatic fashion that I was trying to adhere to, it is just no good. It's just no good. So Kulumani is K-U-H, K-H-U-L-U-M-A-N-I, Kulumani. I don't know. I'll find out, and it's a good question. It'll mean something. If someone, if this were my class, I would say someone should Google that. And someone would Google that and, they'd give me the answer straight away, or they'd contradict me, of course, which is a great thing, Right. I think what I want to do is go back, in fact, a little bit, because I feel like I didn't do entire justice to the inheritance of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you will recall that I spoke about it having inherited certain actions of the government at the time. And I just want to reflect, if you don't mind, a little bit longer on that, because there were aspects that I'm remiss in having left out. And perhaps I didn't cover the legal challenges as fully as I ought to have. And so I want to just reflect briefly for 10 or 15 minutes on the inheritance still, and then I want to move on to amnesty, truth, justice, and the tensions between those ideas and how that played out in South Africa. You will remember that I spoke about the Azapo challenge, that constitutional court case that challenged the amnesty process and said the amnesty process was unconstitutional. And you might remember that the Constitutional Court ruled in favor of the amnesty process and that it ought to continue and that it ought to exist. And so in some respects, once that challenge had been met, that affirmed, if you like, the existential right, the existential right of the Commission to exist and to function in the way that it was going to function. But once the public hearings, and we spoke now about the first public hearing, once the public hearings had commenced, a series of applications were launched by a brigadier and a major general of the former South African Defence Force, Brigadier Dupree and Major General van Rensburg, against the TRC and in particular against some of the procedural aspects relating to the way in which the TRC was doing its work. And these challenges by the general and the brigadier culminated in a judgment in our appellate division, which in fact had a profound effect on shaping the policy in relation to the way in which procedures were shaped within the TRC, and in fact shaped the way in which people who were mentioned in proceedings or people who were applying for certain things like amnesty, the way in which these things happened, timeous notification, things like that. And of course, this is indicative of the fact that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had hardly any time to get up and go, and of course was thinking through how it was functioning whilst it was functioning. So it embraced these challenges, modified its processes, and adjusted in light of judicial decisions. The floodgates, though, for litigation had opened. The Commission faced a barrage of litigation. There was an application by the National Party seeking the censure of the chairperson of the Commission, Archbishop Tutu. The National Party wanted the vice chair removed, Alex Bahrain. They wanted Alex removed. A further application from the National Party in South Africa's Cape High Court sought to challenge amnesty decisions in relation to 37 African National Congress folk who had been granted amnesty. Sought that amnesty to be declared null and void. It lost that challenge. The Inkatha Freedom Party filed a complaint with the public protector about bias, about the Commission's bias, perceived bias. A group of South African Defence Force generals filed a complaint also with the public protector, complaining of the same thing, bias. Yeah. The Commission faced challenges not just from survivors, so the Azapo case wasn't the only case around amnesty, but also from perpetrators in relation to amnesty decisions. So one of the most ironic ones is a legal challenge that arose, and here of course one must pause, because to acknowledge that we had a chemical and biological hearing at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, gives you a sense of the kinds of things that were happening in my country. A chemical and biological hearing. And the mastermind, the project leader, Wouter Basson, who'd of course been subpoenaed by the TRC to give evidence, used the then existing constitution to say, no, it wasn't right that he should come and give evidence, it violated his rights. His rights in terms of the constitution would be infringed if he was compelled to testify. The High Court rejected that and ruled that he should come and testify, quite rightly, of course. So if you look at Volume 1, Chapter 7, and ladies and gentlemen, I haven't given you any reading because the TRC's reports, I think, are adequate for that, and they are available online. And so Volume 1, Chapter 7 outlines all the litigation and all the attacks, legal attacks on the commission. But I literally wanted to just summarize their nature. There were challenges to the existence of the commission and challenges to foundational aspects of the commission, such as amnesty. There were challenges to procedures, in particular those relating to fair notice, what constituted fair notice. There were challenges to impartiality and neutrality relating to the commission, for example, those brought by the National Party and the IFP. There were challenges to amnesty decisions themselves. The commission itself received many subpoenas for information, so rather than you thinking that it might be asking broadly for, it was also itself asked to divulge information. There were complaints to the public protector. 350 South African Defence Force generals launched a complaint with the public protector. There was a failure to appear, an infamous failure to appear by P.W. Botha. And all in all, I think as you reflect on the legal birth of the TRC and the legal challenges in relation to the functioning of the TRC, you cast your mind back to that first presentation I gave about theory, and you begin to see how this creature, the TRC, had to navigate between ideal justice on the one hand, ideal conceptions of justice on the one hand, and political power played through the courts as well, not only through the courts, also on the street and elsewhere. So you can see how that theoretical sort of tension, how that plays out in reality. Now, lest you think I'm done with forgetting, I'm not. And lest you think I'm going to forget, I'm not. Because I want to remember that which we can't remember. I want to reflect on that which it is not possible to remember. And of course, that's an entirely different kind of forgetting. That is a very different kind of forgetting to the forgetting I have just because I'm now, 52 and soon will be, well, not that soon. I want to reflect on the intentional destruction of memory, the purposeful destruction of memory. And in this instance, it again is painful for me not only to talk about chemical and biological warfare, but in this instance to reflect on the official destruction of records. So if you thought that the apartheid government giving itself amnesty was abhorrent, you'd be right. I would agree with you. I'd side with you. And if you feel uncomfortable that they then also destroyed records, I would agree with you too, that purposeful destruction of memory is problematic. Now, I invite you to look at Volume 1, Chapter 8 of the TRC's final report for much more detail than I'm going to give you here today. I simply want to touch on this by way of going back and giving you some more of the inheritance of the TRC. But if you think about it, the story of apartheid itself, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the systematic elimination of millions of voices, of millions of memories, all of which should have been part of my nation's memory. And for me, the elimination of memory, the evisceration of memory, the truncation of memory, the blotting out, the redaction of memory is indeed, if you want to look for an essence, essentially part of the character of apartheid itself. The practice of apartheid for me is in many respects a redaction of what could have been a beautiful shared, commonly shared memory. And of course future, but we're talking about memory in the past. The elimination of memory is also all about beatings and denials and censorship and confiscation of materials, banning, incarceration, assassination. All of these kinds of activities are very intentionally, very purposefully forcing forgetfulness on us. Any attempt, ladies and gentlemen, to reconstruct the past must involve, and the Commission felt this, and I think I feel this too, must involve the recovery of memory. We have to go back and figure out and remember and understand what happened in the past. Much of it, of course, not only in the form of what I call haunting eidetic engrams, so very vivid memories, but also those that are contained in countless documents that exist in the state. Bureaucracies keep records. They do. The tragedy, of course, is that not only did the former government grant itself amnesty, it also systematically and deliberately destroyed a huge body of state records and documentation. Why? I know, I shouldn't laugh. I wrote here, so in an attempt to remove incriminating evidence and thereby sanitize the history of oppressive rule. But even that sounds trite. Yeah. So a definition of apartheid certainly is the elimination of memory. If you want to define, often people will ask me, Clive, what is apartheid? Define apartheid or describe apartheid or give us a sense of apartheid. And one of the things that apartheid, as I've described here, definitely is an intentional elimination of what could be a shared memory, because it prevents the creation of a collective history. And the TRC, ladies and gentlemen, is the exact opposite. The TRC is the reconstruction and co-creation of memory, insofar as it can achieve that. So the urge, one does, I guess, have urges, and the urge in the National Party struck it in the 80s. So the urge to destroy documents you can trace back to the 80s. You can trace it back to a time as early as the 80s when the thought, as we trace it back, and as the TRC has traced it back, first began to kind of circulate within official circles, that it might be a good idea to begin thinking and about what these records say and what these records mean. And of course the context there is all about those secret negotiations in the mid-80s. I think some of you, when I spoke about Mandela, I spoke about secret negotiations. There were certain signs that were beginning to suggest to some folk in the apartheid regime in the 80s that, hey, some of this documentation might be problematic. And this widened into a coordinated endeavor sanctioned by the apartheid cabinet and designed to deny a new democratic government access to the secrets of the former state. So if you think about the functioning of it, if you were a commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and you were sitting and you decided now to take evidence and so forth and hear these stories about human rights violations, I think it would be perfectly natural to begin to say, well, okay, so we've got Policeman X here today and he's talking about what he did. Can we please have those documents that relate to the operation and outline and give us a sense of who ordered that, where did it come from, what were the plans, what about the budget, all those kinds of things that are documented in official records. So of course the TRC makes extensive requests for records, especially from the South African Defence Force and the South African Police Services, and unsurprisingly, of course, also the intelligence agencies. The TRC requested various types of things: personnel files, financial records, and indeed, once we had found out that there was a thing called the Civil Cooperation Bureau, which Prime Evil Eugene de Kock was part of. What an absurd name, Civil Cooperation Bureau. You can only imagine the kind of cooperation they sought, which was, of course, silence. Began to request records, began to request documentations. There was a thing called a Counter-Revolutionary Information Task Team, and when it appeared, the TRC wanted some papers, some documentation. Yeah. Information about military and police operations inside the country and also outside the country. What do you think the answer was? As frequently as it requested documentation is as frequently as it was informed, especially by local police station commanders, regional military personnel in the defense force and in the police, that specific documents, or indeed whole series of documents, had been destroyed. It was told that. There was a general who was asked and is on record as saying, General George Meyring is on record as saying that after the completion of the work of a certain commission of inquiry, the Khan Commission of Inquiry into special secret projects, files relating to these covert operations had been destroyed. He also said at that time that all files that impacted on the safety of individual persons were destroyed. And he said that they were destroyed in terms of a State Security Council decision of a 1993 State Security Council decision. So the TRC initially sees that it's not getting documents relating to specific requests, and then as it thinks about this, kind of gets the sense that there might need to be a more systematic scrutiny of the defense force, of the police, of the intelligence, the secret service, etc., to get an understanding of what was going on with the fact that it couldn't get these documents. It became apparent, in other words, that the nature and the extent of destruction of documentation for purposes of concealing violations of human rights in and of itself constituted an area for it to research. So it hadn't thought about that up until a certain point when it became apparent it couldn't get these documents. It became apparent that that was systemic, in other words, that there was the elimination of documents was systemic. Just to be fair, there were varied responses, and the South African police responded more positively and was able to respond more often to requests than, for example, the Defence Force, and that is also noted in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. Now here's another one which is interesting to me, which I'd forgotten about, but coming to talk with you and researching again and reading again always helps me surface new things, and I like that. Not that this is new, by the way. This is just as problematic as so many other things that happened in our past and that we forget sometimes because we are so perhaps far away from it, and actually we aren't. So layered onto this experience at the TRC, this experience it had with the destruction of official records, and if you like, as an adjunct to the more formal debates which this destruction of memory, this willful destruction of memory brought to the fore during the functioning of the TRC is another incident which became public, in fact, during the early stages of our negotiation process, and which thrust again this question of forgetting and memory into the public debate at the time. And this was this thing about the public disclosure in 1991 that the National Intelligence Service had destroyed a sound recording made of a meeting between Nelson Mandela and P.W. Botha in 1989. Yeah. So the legality of that, this is absurd. You know, this is as absurd as Zuma's argument that he needs a swimming pool at his house because if the house catches fire, he has water to put the fire out with. I mean, I have a swimming pool to swim in. I don't know, you may or may not have a pool. I don't have a pool, by the way, but if I had a pool, I would swim in it. And I would tell folk, that's why I've got the pool. So the legality of the destruction was challenged. So the point I'm making is there's a bit of absurdity coming. You probably would guess that. And it was challenged on the grounds that the director of public archives hadn't authorized that destruction of that sound recording. Fair enough. On the 10th of December 1991, the state president's office secured state legal opinion indicating that sensitive documents, those requiring secrecy, were in their nature not archives and therefore not subject to the Archives Act. But it gets more interesting. The National Intelligence Service then also gets its own legal opinion, which, and this is in the TRC's final report, by the way, which not only confirms the previous finding, the previous opinion, but also argues that sound recordings, because they aren't written documents, are not in their nature archives either. So, yeah, you don't need to archive a sound recording. These opinions, of course, had alarming implications for us. Any state record that was sensitive could be destroyed without even consulting then with the National Director of Archives. I wrote here to myself when I was preparing this morning, I think it would have been obviously right and proper to preserve such an historic encounter, don't you? and I don't understand the legal views at all. I understand the politics of it, though. And isn't that just the point? Yeah, legal absurdity. You can see the politics of it. Let's talk frankly about the politics. I want to. So in July 1993, all government departments were told by the Security Secretariat of the time to destroy all classified records received by them from other sources. Special mention, in fact, was made of the need to destroy documentation that related to a thing called the National Security Management System. I don't want to go into that, but it in effect operated as a shadow cabinet. And the TRC was quite at pains to try and pinpoint accountability to this structure rather than the democratically elected cabinet as being the locus of decision making. And so special mention was made of the need to destroy documentation relating to the NSMS, the National Security Management System, that had been developed in the 80s. With the April 1994 general election looming, and despite the destruction of records which had been taking place, of course you could see the government of the day in the context, in the words of the TRC, clearly becoming anxious about which state records the new government would inherit. Here are my words. quite frankly, the government of the day was in panic. Yeah, it was in panic. It gave itself amnesty because it was in panic. It destroyed all these papers because it was panicking. Why was it panicking? Because it was that bad. It was that bad. TRC is altogether more polite than I am. In late 1993, I think I end on this point and then we move on to something else. In late 1993, the President's office had requested an opinion from the chief state law advisor as to whether representatives of the government of the day could retain custody of certain records. It seems they wanted to keep some records but wanted to retain custody of those records. The TRC was able to find a draft memorandum preceding that request, and that draft memorandum seemed to suggest that one of the motivations to keep some of this and to keep it out of the hands of the new government was for exactly that purpose, to keep this information out of the hands, and I'm quoting from the TRC report, to keep this information out of the hands of future co-governors. Right, let's just see, how are we doing for time? How are you all doing? Good? Okay, so yeah, and I have a device to remind me of the time. We're going to go for another 15 minutes and then we'll do some Q&A, and I haven't forgotten. Right, let's then reflect a little bit on questions of truth, amnesty, and justice. So a little more philosophical, but also a little less philosophical, because of course there's a lot of philosophy inherent just in those concepts, as you will recognize, but there was a whole dose of pragmatism in the context of the Commission when it had to interpret those philosophical concepts and give reality to them in the context of its functioning. If there was one thing that the TRC was concerned with, and there were a few, there was one thing that was central to the TRC, it was the truth. It was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was called that also because the truth was so important to it and to so many of us. Sorry about that. Now, the thing is, the truth is a complex concept, and the truth is a complex thing in reality. So part of the challenge was, whose truth? Which truth? What is truth? And certainly those questions and the complexity of the answers to those questions emerged as the debates and discussions began to take place in relation to to putting in place the Commission, and then, of course, whilst it deliberated. Now, so in other words, it was an ongoing and a recurring debate. It's not something that we have a full answer on. You know, South Africans do not lay claim to knowing more than you do or anyone else does about what truth is. And in many respects, we answered that question for ourselves and what it meant for us in the context of a TRC at the time. One of the criticisms of our TRC and TRCs in general is that they need to think more fully about what concepts like truth and amnesty and reconciliation mean before they start working. We didn't, of course, do a lot of that, but during our work, we managed to document some of our understanding, and that, of course, is being taken on by academics and others and documented and discussed. And so the kind of truth that the Commission defined for itself had four branches or four aspects to it. And I want to just talk about each of those because they then begin to define the essential character of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first of those, sorry, I really am not happy with this microphone today. I keep on injuring it. The first of those is factual or forensic truth. The second of those is personal or narrative truth. The third of those is a social or a dialogic type truth. And the fourth of those is a truth which relates to healing and restoration. And these four aspects of truth were for the Commission the cornerstones or the pillars of its definition and its approach to truth. Now remember, truth was important because it also featured in the amnesty process. You couldn't get amnesty if you didn't tell the truth. So it's important to understand that the TRC needed to figure this question of truth out as much as we, as human beings in South Africa, needed to do that as well. So when it comes to factual or forensic truth, that's familiar. You know what that means. That's the kind of truth, legal truth, scientific truth, the notion of bringing to light factual, corroborated evidence, of obtaining accurate information through reliable procedures. And this featured as part of the Commission's proceedings. This was important for the Commission. It had a team of folk, and these folk would be charged with obtaining and corroborating and getting accurate forensic information. In fact, the Act itself, the very Act that gave birth to the TRC, said, and I quote, that the Commission prepare a comprehensive report which sets out its activities and findings based on factual and objective information and evidence, collected or received by it or placed at its disposal. So, in pursuing this factual truth, the Commission recognized that it needed to search for the factual truth in relation to individuals. So it was required to make findings on particular incidents in respect of very specific people. That was a very forensic, very factual, very clearly mandated thing that it had to do. What happened to who, where, when, why, and how, and who was involved, etc., that kind of thing. In order to do that, it adopted an extensive verification and corroboration policy and procedure in order to make sure that everything it was doing in relation to this kind of truth was accurate, factually correct. The second area in relation to this pillar was about the bigger picture. It was about contexts, causes, and patterns of violations. And again, there, as any good social scientist would, part of understanding patterns and contexts and causes is about the evidence that you gather to suggest that those patterns did exist. The Commission was required, in fact, to report on broader patterns underlying gross human rights violations, and it was required to explore also the causes of these violations. So it had to analyze, interpret, and draw inferences from a vast range of information, and certainly then had to adopt the social scientists' approach to understanding these wider pictures. Using its database, secondary sources, etc., etc. Yeah. Now, I just want to deviate slightly and talk about a limitation which truth commissions have in relation to the truth. And this, I think, is expressed best by Michael Ignatieff, a very well-known transitional justice scholar and academic who also advised and informed our TRC, but is now very active in the transitional justice field. And what he said is that when it comes to the truth, and I say this by way of backdrop to the next point I want to make, he says that by way of truth, all that truth that a truth commission can achieve, that's quite a big statement, all that a TRC can achieve is to reduce the number of lies in circulation, the number of lies that can be circulated unchallenged in the public discourse. So what he says is, for example, in Argentina, the work of a TRC has made it impossible to claim for example, that the military did not throw half-dead survivors into the sea from helicopters. You can't claim that in Argentina anymore. In Chile, it is no longer possible to assert in public that the Pinochet regime did not dispatch thousands of entirely innocent people. And of course, in talking about the centrality of the truth to the South African experience and applying Ignatieff's notion that I've just described to you, i.e. the reduction of the number of lies in public circulation, one can say that the information gleaned, the search for the truth, the centrality of the truth to our endeavor now makes it impossible to claim that the practice of torture by state security forces was not widespread and systematic. No one can claim that in my country because we've surfaced that. That only a few rotten eggs or bad apples committed gross violations of human rights. We know that that's not true. That the state was not directly and indirectly involved on so-called black-on-black violence. That was if we had another half hour, we could talk about that entire concept. That the chemical and biological warfare program was only defensive in nature. We can't claim that anymore because we now know. That slogans by sections of the liberation movement did not contribute to the killing of settlers or farmers. This is a very controversial point, by the way. Slogans such as "one settler, one bullet, bring me my machine gun." We know that it did. We can't claim that in public anymore. That is something we can't do. And that the accounts of gross human rights violations in the African National Congress camps were the consequence of state disinformation. And you see the balance here. You see the attempt by the TRC to be even-handed there, which is a beautiful thing. We can't make those claims. More succinctly and pithily, disinformation about the past that has been accepted as truth by some members of society through the surfacing of the truth lost a lot of its credibility. And that's one very powerful thing that the TRC did for us. This idea of personally narrated truth was something that Archbishop Tutu was very articulate on. And he said, this commission, he said this in my hometown, Port Elizabeth, on the 21st of May in 1996, he said this. He said, this commission is said to listen to everyone. It is therefore important that everyone should be given a chance to say his or her truth as he or she sees fit. By telling their stories, survivors and perpetrators gave meaning to the multi-layered experiences of the South African story. By listening to these stories, these personal truths, by listening to these stories, by allowing them to be communicated also to the public through the media, the value, in fact, the recognition of the value that South Africans have a strong social and cultural oral tradition, a tradition of telling stories, a tradition which in fact our act recognized. It's such a strong and such an important tradition of storytelling that it was recognized also procedurally in the act. As I've put here, in fact, it's a distinctive and unique feature of the legislation governing the Commission itself. The Act explicitly recognized the healing potential of storytelling. So it was built into the Act. And these stories needed not to be dealt with as one might present arguments in a court of, or claims in a court of law. These were stories where people had, many times for the first time, the opportunity to sit down and be taken seriously. And so this question of social truth flowing from personally narrated truth is probably the kind of truth that the TRC felt most central to its endeavor as a bridge between the past and the future. So on the one hand, it was important to get the forensic stuff right, to get the amnesty stuff right, to get the real story as right with evidence as it could, but it was also interested in being a bridge between the past and the future, and social truth for it was part and parcel of that. It was in the search for social truth that the closest connection between, if you like, the Commission's process and its end goal could be found. Now, there is an interesting story to be told about Justice L.B. Sachs. There are many interesting stories to be told about L.B. Amazing stories. He was on our constitutional court. He can be credited also with starting our wonderful art collection at the court, by the way. I don't know if any of you have heard of Justice Sachs. L.B. Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. There is a TED Talk. I think it's called Soft Vengeance. I think L.B. called it Soft Vengeance. It's a very powerful snippet, 20 minutes or so on reconciliation, because what had happened to L.B. is he got a letter in the post. I don't know if you get letters in the post, they're usually bills. Yeah, I never go to my post box downstairs because it's always, what do I know, Verizon and things. No one writes me a nice letter, except sometimes I get a letter from students. Handwritten, beautiful letters. He got a letter in the post. When he opened the letter, it blew him up. He was in Maputo at the time. Blew him up. But he lived. And he lived without an arm. And so when you watch some of this film, you will see he talks about the fact that he couldn't shake the hand of the person who blew him up because he didn't have an arm to shake the hand of the... But that tells you that he met, in fact, in his chambers, I think once or twice, that person who had blown him up. Yeah. He says he got a very lovely present late in life because he married and he had a child very late in his life. You should watch it if you are interested. It's a L.B. Sachs talks about social truth as distinct from what he called microscopic truth. He spoke about microscope truth and dialogue truth. The first, he said, and I quote from him, is factual, verifiable, can be documented, can be proved. Dialogue truth, on the other hand, is social truth, the truth of experience that is established through interaction, discussion, and debate. And it is this kind of interaction, this kind of dialogue truth that the TRC was very interested in the context of participation, in the context of transparency, and in the context of creating and co-creating a new shared truth, a truth woven by many, if you like, narratives and not just one. And after all, remember, we were used to only one narrative, which is why I should shut up. Because I sound now like I'm only doing the talking. We've got to question time. We've actually got into, I've pressed 1 minute into your time, so it's your time. I don't know. Do any of you have questions? Yes, ma'am.
So, was there no punishment for L.B. Sachs for the person that he kept meeting with who was on his arm?
Yeah.
What was the process?
I can't remember what happened to that specific. So, was there any punishment for the person who had blown up L.B. Sachs? What was the process in that instance? And I can't remember the specifics of that particular case. It sounds to me like if he met that person, he would have got amnesty. That's what it sounds like from that. And that's why I got that question about what is it like to, what is it like for a victim, a survivor, if you hear that the person who blew your arm off was just given amnesty. I don't know if he got amnesty, but I think he did because he turned up in the justice's chambers twice. So I'm sure he must have I think he must have got amnesty. But the principle there is, and I was talking to a gentleman, I can't see him now, about this particular question. He asked me about it before we started, which is, so what happens? Someone gets amnesty and then you hear as a survivor that they were granted amnesty and they did something like that or worse. I mean, at least he was alive, So how would you feel if and this is why you had these cases that went to the Constitutional Court, because folk like the family of Biko and Plainclothes and others felt so aggrieved that they felt that the TRC itself was so wrong. They simply did not accept this question of amnesty. So that's it helps us highlight that tension. That's why I talk about the tensions that exist, and I talk about them as unresolvable. Because how are we ever to resolve them? And what does it mean if a tension like that is unresolvable? Because if it's unresolvable, and I think actually it is, it means we have to live with it. We have to live with ambiguity and unresolvability. Is there such a word? We have to live with these kinds of things in post-transitional societies, because some of this stuff is not resolvable. Yeah.
Also, if you're living with this, I mean, how does forgiveness or bitterness affect the rest of your life?
Yeah.
You have to face that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. 2 or 3 more slides down here, we're going to talk specifically about forgiveness, about revenge, about anger. This wasn't just a sterile test tube experiment where none of you are spot on. This was real lives, real people, human beings. I argue, with someone, and it takes me a while to forgive them. Maybe you never do, maybe you never forgive them. And so I don't want to preempt my lecture, but the question for us as South Africans is, what does forgiveness mean? What does forgiveness and forgetting mean? How do we link forgiveness and remembering and revenge and anger and hatred? And how do we deal with that, what sounds like a quite toxic mix? And can we recognize that we can't? And what does that mean? And what did that mean for us at the time? Because there were people like you and me. I was a perpetrator of an apartheid atrocity. You were a survivor, and we were this far apart from each other, and we were looking at each other. Sometimes we were meeting afterwards. Sometimes we were talking together. Other times people collapsed, and people had to be helped out and things like that. So we're talking about real feelings, real, experiences. Yes, ma'am.
Just like a procedural question.
Yeah.
Say a victim were testifying before the commission, did they take a kind of oath before they gave their narrative?
Yeah.
What is
To tell the truth, yeah.
Was it like on a Bible?
I can't remember if it was on a Bible. I would be surprised if it wasn't, because the amnesty hearings were much more judicial in nature. They had advocates and lawyers representing them and so forth. That was much more about this forensic truth. So if you applied for amnesty, you had to tell the truth. And that was much more a forensic legal process. And that's a good question. Not everyone would want a Bible. I can't remember.
That might be some of you could actually watch videos that might show this.
Yes, and you know what I should show you, because I'd been asked a question about procedure in the last lecture, and I suggested that these procedures were blurry and indistinct and not always that well developed. And in fact, I have footage to show you of a person who applied for amnesty. He'd killed 11 people and applied for amnesty and got it. Yeah. And then went to the community where the 11 people lived that he had killed, and of course their families and so forth were there. I'll show it to you. How about I show it to you? The thing is, it'll take 20 minutes, but I'll show you. The first snippet is his amnesty hearing. And the second is him going to this community, the trust feed community, and what happens there. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for you, except to say that it's a mess. And I've been saying that hybrid processes like this, ambiguous ones, processes where you're dealing with unresolvability and so forth, that these things are not clear-cut, templatable. We can't simply say, here's a process and it will always deliver an outcome. There are various ways of getting there. I know that you wanted me to reflect on the Justice for Palestine panel. And I would say that this isn't relevant to the rest of the subject. So if you wanted to leave, and I don't know, by the way, are there any more questions? Yes, sir.
Was there any consultation support between the TRC and the Law Court of The Hague?
No. So these concepts, that's a good question. That's an excellent question. These concepts differ fundamentally. And for us, it was a local process that was restorative in nature and that was meant to heal. It was not about accountability and about prosecution and about, in fact, even a witch hunt. It could, because you could go that far politically. And had we done that, we would have been following the more Nuremberg, more hard justice approach, accountability approach, which I think would have scuppered the entire negotiation and peace process post the democratic elections. So whilst one would have wished, and there were many people who probably would have wished for that to be an option, it wasn't. It was never, that sort of option was never an option. The panel on Justice for Palestine went very peacefully. There was a policeman in the top corner, I think. I don't know what a plainclothes policeman looks like, but he looked like a plainclothes policeman. I hope you'll forgive me if I've got him wrong. Well, you should ask me what I think that looks like. I don't know how I'd answer that question. Plain? Sorry. And it was because it went so peacefully that I had problems with it. And certainly one finds that the power dynamic that played out and that plays out is what stifled the debate. And so it is hard when one has a power dynamic as strong as the one in relation to Israel and Palestine to, in the first instance, even then begin to voice respectfully critical perspectives, which ought to be a characteristic of a democracy. And so there was this bigger geopolitical power thing that was playing out on stifling discussion and debate. And then, of course, there was the plainclothes policemen and other administration folk there. And if you're taking a salary and if you have kids to put through school and a mortgage, hey, I'm not saying I'm not brave. And I'm not saying I didn't say what I wanted to say. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that also affects, the power dynamic affects the nature of the discourse and impacts on democracy. And we need to think, I think, that was a micro experience for me in relation to power and in relation to the impact that has on freedom of speech. And it felt pretty stifling. It felt pretty stifling to me. It reminded me, and I did say it there, it reminded me of the kind of power that was exerted over me, that beat the wonder out of me, that caused me not to be able to speak and others freely. It's an apartheid dictatorship. So those are my reflections on a very peaceful, very docile, very gentle evening. Yeah, which I describe in that way because you can hear, what I'm saying when I describe it like that. I mean, we could have had a wonderful, vigorous debate, and it would have been great. Well, one more question.
You talked about the TRC for obliterating memory.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, to this day, how is this subject taught in South African high school and college, to what extent, and how available are other resources?
Yeah.
Other than TRC to explain it?
Thank you so much for that question. The simple truth of the matter is we don't do enough. And when I go to South Africa, young people don't know what the 16th of June means. They don't know what the TRC was. They hardly remember who the people were who struggled for their freedom. We don't teach enough of it. We don't do enough of this in our country. And it is a huge gap that we don't have in our education system, much more of this sort of thing. I was trying to find an event on the 16th of June in Port Elizabeth to take my students to. And of course, 16th of June is the day Hector Peterson was killed. It's the Soweto riots. You know, it's the entire Soweto uprising in South Africa, which was hugely pivotal in the point of no return against apartheid. There are no events commemorating that day. You know, we'd rather go down to the beach and have a holiday, and a lot of people are driving somewhere because they want to make a long weekend. Fine, you know, of course we have to enjoy our lives. You know, I was just thinking the other day, what a shame it is to have to spend 2 years of your life in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when you could be reading good books and watching good films and enjoying a good meal and being with your family and friends. Not that do you know the point I'm trying to make is, you see the broader point there, yeah. So it is a great shame that we don't do more of that. Thank you so much.
We have to make that the last question.
Thank you.
You will take those coffee cups out with you?